Hi, my name is Jimmy Humphrey, and I would just like to take a moment right now to talk to you about the Kingdom of God. The Kingdom of God has been proclaimed for a long time. The prophets of old anticipated it, and ultimately anticipated its coming in the person of Jesus Christ. And through their prophecies, they predicted that everything that we know, everything that we hold dear, the very way that we live our existence would ultimately be threatened by God's kingdom. That God's kingdom would ultimately bring about the ultimate end of all kingdoms and all nations and all peoples. That it would ultimately triumph over all the forces of this world as Jesus Christ comes back one day to establish His rule and His reign forever and ever, from sea to sea. And ultimately that this would undo everything you've ever known in this world. And that these victories that the kingdom of God would experience as God demonstrated His rule and His reign wouldn't just be at the end of the world when everything wraps up, but that this, in part, would be a gradual process, that throughout time you would see the triumph of the kingdom of God over the kingdoms of this world, that God's kingdom would ultimately put an end to all kingdoms. And we see this stretching back all throughout history. We see in Daniel's vision about how the fall and decline of the Roman Empire, how the nation of Babylon would be overthrown, and that the Greeks and the Medes and the Persians would be overthrown, and ultimately at the end, towards the end of the world, that the last kingdom that is established in this world would eventually be overthrown. And this could all be traced back, the prophets said, ultimately to the rule and reign of God as King of kings and Lord of lords. And that His kingdom is ultimately above all other kingdoms, and that all kingdoms of this world are ultimately subjected to His rule and His reign. And that He determines the times and the seasons and the habitations of the dwellings of the people of this world. And so I just wanted to bring this out to you and offer it up in consideration of our own country in America. You know, we've kind of believed this founding fathers' principle and philosophy that America is this great nation that will last forever and ever, and that it will endure for all time, and that because of our principles of democracy and capitalism and all these other sort of ways of life and political philosophy and economic theory and all that sort of stuff, that we would ultimately endure and prosper forever as a nation. But really, this stands in stark contrast to the teachings of the kingdom of God, which do teach that one day everything that can be shaken will be shaken. And those things which can be shaken and destroyed will ultimately give way to those things which are eternal and cannot be destroyed and cannot be shaken. So if you examine this world and the life you live and look at the place that you work and the place that you live and the place that you go hang out with, the place that you have your very existence in, ultimately everything you know and hold dear to your life, the Scriptures teach, is ultimately destined to perish. And it's not just waiting for the last day in which God will bring all these things to pass, although that's certainly in God's mind, but you will see such things happen gradually over time as perishable things undergo the stress of the shakings of God's wrath and God's anger, and that those things ultimately collapse. And I'm just here to kind of tell you today that prophetically that I believe that we will ultimately see this even with our nation in America, that we will be shaken and that we will experience such violence in our own land that we will ultimately be overturned, and that many people will perish, and that many people will die, and that entire ways of existence that we've known as a society, as a culture, as a people, is ultimately threatened by God and His kingdom, because these things are ultimately man-made and not having their origins in heaven and under God's kingdom and on God's rule and God's reign. There are some people that believe that America will experience a revival of some sorts that will cause it to endure forever and ever. That's not going to happen. Sorry, Glenn Beck. Ultimately, the kingdom of God will triumph over this kingdom. And ultimately, this nation is destined to fail and collapse. So, knowing these things, what kind of life should you live? Should your life not be different? Should you not live in expectation that great violence and bloodshed will happen on this American soil, and not just be some sort of lesson that we read about in the history book with the Declaration of Independence and the American Revolutionary Wars and all those sort of things. No, it's not just something that happened in the 1700s and 1800s, but it's something that I'm here to tell you right now will again happen on our own land one day. And the fact of the matter is we've already begun to see it. We've already begun to see the rampant destruction that nature is wreaking on our country. But fact of the matter, it's not just Mother Nature at work. Rather, it's the hand of God hovering over our nation, ready to destroy us whenever He and His righteous judgment decide that the time is to come, that we should be a nation that no longer exists, that we should be a people who should be utterly decimated and reduced to nothing. So I would urge you, while the time is still fresh, and while you still have life, and while you still live in relative ease and comfort, that you would surrender your life to the gospel of Jesus Christ, that you would believe in God's only begotten Son, that you would live your life for Him, recognizing that these things will ultimately come to pass, that the kingdom of God will ultimately triumph over the kingdom of this world, and that everything that you are living your life for, that you are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week for, is ultimately destined to perish. And it's ultimately going to become like grains of sand running through your fingers, just so quickly, so swiftly, and so easily. It'll come before you know it. When things seem like they're peaceful, that's when the Scriptures say sudden destruction will come. I think we may see these very things in our very lifetime. I don't know that for sure, but I do know one thing, that heaven has declared that America will eventually fall, and that things will never be as they've always been. I hope you receive this message in the seriousness that I've proclaimed it to you. Be blessed. Give your life to God. Jimmy Humphrey here.